It's an honor to be here. I have to say, first of all, that I was called upon at the last moment to actually step in because one of the original keynote speakers had to withdraw. But as you may have noticed, there are no women among the keynote speakers. And I think I know why the organizers have failed to find a candidate that would redress this gender imbalance, because no women professor would be so reckless and foolhardy and stupid to volunteer for a keynote speak on such a short notice. So that's why you have yet another middle-aged white male in the 50s standing in front of you. So here we go. Why is it that I have chosen this particular topic? And I guess, and I think Mark alluded to it, in my academic career has revolved around themes that, when presented to my colleagues and friends in academia, almost gave me this eerie feeling of not being entirely in conformity with established norms in Middle Eastern studies, and what should you actually do when you do Middle East studies, of being guilty of not, if not violating, then at least approaching some of the taboos in the discipline. My first book-length study, which was on the Muslim Brotherhood's early history, received quite a good number of good reviews, but I remember very distinctly that a professor reproached me at the time, and he reproached me for being, or she actually, for being too sympathetic, too uncritical of the Muslim Brotherhood, of trying to understand them to such an extent that I almost sort of adopted their discourse. That was some of the criticism. And I thought at the time that criticism was unfair, but I have since sort of realized that scholarship on Islamism in general often tend to be sometimes overly critical, in the sense that almost to the point of deliberately misinterpreting Islamist viewpoint in order to demonstrate critical distance to Islamism and Islamist movements. My second major work brought me near what I would call, perhaps not a taboo, but at least a blind spot in Middle East studies. Namely my study on the Palestinian police and security forces in the West Bank and Gaza. That was during the period of their establishment in the early and mid-1990s as part of the now defunct Oslo process. So very few Middle Eastern scholars study police or other internal security forces. So how do I know this? Well, actually, what about you? Have you ever read a book about an Arab police force? I mean, contemporary police forces, not historical, sort of the Palestine police in the 30s, or the British or the Egyptian police in the last century. I mean, contemporary studies. If we search, we find very few studies. Here are some of them, but they're not sort of. This one is not within sort of Middle Eastern studies. It's sort of more like a practical. Policy-oriented study, Journal of Information Management. Okay, the next one is sort of a think tank paper. It's a good one. I know this stuff, but it's not sort of within sort of the established Middle Eastern journals. And then this is 19th century again. Of course, I will be. So I'm ashamed that I show a picture of my own book. But let's go on and see if we search Google Scholar. And let's just for the comparison, let's see what happens if we search for the Norwegian police. All the titles, the first titles are, the word Norwegian police is in the title. And I could go further and further down, but loads of stuff. But if we search, for example, the Egyptian police force has 500,000 people. It's quite important in Egypt, obviously. When I lived in Egypt in my mid-90s, it was I remember I met people who were saving money because they wanted the price for getting your son into the police academy was £15,000. This was in '95, and the very fact that people were saving money to get their sons into the police academy, sort of, at me, that's an indication that this must be important. I mean, this is something we have to study, but we don't. So let's check Google Scholar. It's actually very few studies. None of the top retrieved articles have the Egyptian police as in their title. In fact, if we study, as Middle Eastern scholars, police forces in the Middle East, it's mostly in the context of highlighting abuses, atrocities, human rights violations. In other words, the study object is the victims of police abuses in the Arab Mukhabarat states. And the latter phrase, which I've used myself on numerous occasions, is so entrenched in our mind that obviously it's for young people, students, young scholars, it's obvious to me that why would anyone want to devote their early academic career to study these brutal entities? I mean, at least with the empathy that is needed in order to understand the world of an Egyptian policeman and a police unit in such an authoritarian context. So I think it's a pity that we don't devote more attention and studies to this topic. My third major field of research is a topic which we may term jihadism, militant Islamism, or terrorism even. In fact, I spent a few years in my career studying terrorism in general as part of a background to better understand jihadism. And I can assure you, from my experiences over the past 20 years, terrorism is definitely a taboo in Middle East studies. So don't, if you want to make a career in Middle East studies, don't use terrorism at least not in the titles of articles you would like to publish. So this is just one example of critique of the terrorism concept. It's a highly politicized, intellectually contestable, it's damaging to community relations, to use this term, and it's largely counterproductive in the struggle to control. And then we find one of the alternatives, subaltern violence. That's sort of an alternative, one of many alternatives that have been suggested. So if you use terrorism inadvertently without quotation mark, and thereby sort of give this repugnant term some credibility, you run a very high risk of being banished from the Middle East studies community. So the term has been vilified over and over again. So and some of them, the critical terrorism studies is one response to traditional terrorism studies, which and critical terrorism studies criticizes very much the term, even if they call themselves critical terrorism studies. And here is one sort of response. You should try to find, and I quote, more flexible and ethical, responsible alternatives. And here are some of the alternatives, insurgency, ideology, anti-imperialism, nationalism, militants, revolutionaries, and I could go on. But frankly, I do not really understand how these terms will cover the very specific form of political violence that terrorism represents. And I also fail to grasp why is it ethical, irresponsible to label ISIS and Al-Qaeda attacks on civilian targets for but I think it's like if we decide very much that we don't want to use the term terrorism at all, we sort of there are things that we're not going to be able to describe and analyze. Personally, I have not been outlawed or ostracized from Middle East studies, from the Middle East Studies cluster in Norwegian academia. So, but I remember when I was hired at the University of Oslo 6 years ago, the evaluation committee explicitly stressed in their assessment report that my research on Islamism or Islamist jihadi violence or terrorism was not like traditional terrorism studies, and the committee clearly felt that this was such an important point that that phrase was put in italics. So I mean, to distance what I did from terrorism was obviously important. So, but when my book on Abu Musab al-Suri was reviewed back in 2008 or 9, I think it was, a very prominent Middle Eastern scholar in London, in an article, review article about the book and 2 other books, she labeled that review sort of the terrorism industry. My book was part of the terrorism industry. So it's quite a stigmatizing label, sort of indicating that I'm sort of make money out of terrorism. There is a huge and growing literature on jihadism, and also an academically sophisticated one, but much of this gets published outside of Middle Eastern studies. So if you try to get published, to publish anything on terrorism, on jihadism in, for example, the International Studies of International Journal of Middle East Studies, sort of the flagship in Middle East Studies, then I don't think really you should use the term terrorism, at least not in the title. So how do I know this? This is a search I just did on searching for terrorism in NCMES, and I do admit, I mean, they do book reviews where the title in the book title has the word terrorism, where the term terrorism appears in the title. It might appear somewhere else, but given the length of the duration of the NCMES journal and its status, I find that a bit remarkable. Also, given the fact that NCMES is covering a region where you have one of the highest recorded number of terrorist attacks in the world, according to Global Terrorism Database. So for a flagship journal not to have one single article about terrorism, it's a bit remarkable. So what about jihadism? Is that's a newer term? It wasn't much used in the 90s. It started to appear mostly in 2000s, although the word jihadism, you can find it in the 90s, but not so common. No, I mean, don't even use the word jihadism in the title. I mean, there are articles about militant Islamists in NCMES, but jihadi or jihadism, those two terms do not appear, as far as I can see, in the article titles in the journal. So in sum, I guess it's fair to say that researching terrorism and jihadism might be a bit of a career killer at universities if the hiring committees at these universities consider NCMES as sort of the golden standard for success in Middle East studies. So obviously certain themes in Middle East studies might be avoided or are rarely studied in depth. And it's not only terrorism and jihadism that have been sort of a bit of a taboo topic in traditional terrorism studies. I have a feeling that there seems to be an avoidance of certain themes, perhaps of fear of stigmatizing or demonizing people in the Middle East. Perhaps we also do so inadvertently in fear of sort of ending up in among the Orientalists, the Orientalist camp. And one of these understudied themes is racism. Compared to the focus on Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, surprisingly little has been written on racism towards non-Arabs, black people, migrant workers, and so on in the Arab world. Not so. I guess perhaps it's a bit unfair to say there are no studies on migrant workers and racism towards migrant workers. There are, but I do question at least. Is it fair to claim that Arabs are mostly studied as victims rather than as perpetrators of racist discrimination and violence? Okay, let's. Here are a slide showing a comparison of two researches on Google Scholar. The first is racism in the Arab world, and the other is racism in the Middle East. Can you read it? And it's sort of striking. Only one of the 10 retrieved studies. Obviously, if you go further down, you might find one or two articles or so, but it's not like. I mean, those who appear on the top is sort of indicative of how common it is to study this. There is just one article on migrant workers and xenophobia in the region. I mean, it's hard not to notice racism in one form or another when traveling and living in the Middle East, like in most other regions. I do by no means claim expert knowledge about the extent and gravity of racism, xenophobia, discrimination in the region. But based on my personal experiences with friends, colleagues, students with dark skin, who I think it's sufficiently serious and widespread that it warrants academic research. If we do a similar research for Europe, the results are very, very different. So racism in Europe, I mean, it's like all the articles have that term in the title. So I guess this term, this topic qualifies as a possible taboo, or at least a blind spot in Middle East studies. And media coverage of racism in Arab countries has been there for many, many years. But we in the scholar community have apparently not followed up, basically. More generally, I think we tend to shy away from themes that put people in the Middle East in a bad light. Not always, not everywhere, but certain themes are unpopular because they might sort of reinforce stereotypes about people in the region. So should we do so? Should we think that a research topic should we rethink a research topic if the findings are unpleasant? We would obviously never censor ourselves from research which might uncover widespread racist attitudes in the Norwegian middle upper class. So are we unconsciously doing so because we believe that the Middle East and people in the Middle East are fragile, are a fragile, weak underdog in a sense, that we need to treat them with silk gloves and shield them from the full force of academic scrutiny? Isn't also such an attitude a bit patronizing? I'm just throwing this out as a question. So 2 years ago, I and several colleagues, we worked on a special issue. I'm now mentioning another theme that was I felt at the time was a bit of a non-starter. We worked on a special issue on patriarchy in the Middle East, and it got eventually published in Die Welt des Islams. I'm not arguing that patriarchy is not a taboo, is a taboo topic. It is not. There are lots of articles and books about the theme, but I do remember very distinctly that one of the editors we contacted for this special issue, he wrote in response that he said he cringed at the idea of publishing an article on patriarchy in the Middle East because the patriarchy term had such an Orientalist flavor. Okay. so, so perhaps it has become a bit of a taboo to study themes that might be said to portray, I quote, Arabs, Muslims, Middle Easterners in a negative light. For example, and now I'm touching upon another theme, why is it that a book like Mein Kampf is so popular in the region? According to one study, the book became the bestseller in Turkey in March 2005. So here's a picture from a bookseller in downtown Amman, and the most typical books are about or on or about Adolf Hitler, about Saddam Hussein, and about a wide variety of conspiracy theories, Protocols of the Elder Zions being a very popular one. So how is it that these books are so popular? Because obviously these street vendors wouldn't have put out their books, these type of books, if it wasn't like this was good business. Shouldn't this be something we study? As we would definitely do if such books appeared in great numbers among the street vendors in Helsinki or in Oslo or in Copenhagen. The role of conspiracy theories in politics and in political imagination is obviously a theme that has been studied, but not perhaps as much as you would expect, given the prominence of it in the Middle East. It's very common to encounter people in the region who argue that the 9/11 attacks were not carried out by Al-Qaeda, but by Mossad or the CIA, who then blamed it on the Muslims. So is this an understudied theme, the role and extent of conspiracy theories in popular imagination and politics in the region? Apart from a handful of studies, I couldn't find a lot of good articles on the role of conspiracy theories in the region. There are some, but not many. Given its prominence, I sort of should expect that this would be a more prominent topic in academia. But then I guess I think I know one of the explanations for this. It's not the general one that I mentioned, but it's also the fact that the famous and notorious Daniel Pipes, a very prominent right-wing pundit and activist, is one of the key figures behind the notorious Campus Watch back in the 2000s. He is author of one of the most cited books on conspiracy theories in the region. He appears here on the second most quoted book, and obviously the theme has basically become a bit toxic. Or has it? I mean, I just posing the question: has it become toxic because of Daniel Pipes' presence? Because if you write about it, in a sense, you have to cite Daniel Pipes, and who want to have Daniel Pipes in his footnotes? I mean, it's like, yeah. So a related theme is also the extent, and I'm now approaching a theme I know a bit more about, the popular support of jihadism in the Middle East. In fact, conspiracy theories and extremism, these are sort of not necessarily twins, but they're closely related phenomena. So contrary to what many believe, there is a surprisingly high number of people in the region who voice support and sympathy for jihadi groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So as you will see on this slide, there is significant public support for ISIS in a number of Arab countries. And by significant, I mean more than 1 or 2%. There will always be, an extremist fringe of a few people. But if we talk about 3% or more, then we're actually talking about who say that they are very positive to ISIS. In a poll, I mean, in 3% in Egypt would be obviously 3 million people. And I would argue that if 3 million Egyptians are very positive to ISIS, as these figures suggest, then it's clearly a topic worth studying further. Here's another slide showing polls regarding support for Al-Qaeda in selected in a few Arab Middle Eastern countries. Obviously, there is a critical and at least not negligent mass of support for jihadism, it seems. These numbers are much lower than it used to be in the 2000s. So in several countries, there are people with a favorable opinion of Al-Qaeda. The number of people, they represent double-digit percentage of the respondents. So given that, we know that sympathizers tend to be concentrated in certain areas, certain city quarters. In my view, this would create, or has at least the potential of creating sort of a fish in the water effect for jihad insurgents, to borrow a Maoist term. So why is it that average people voice support for these groups, these extremist groups? Why is this the case? And I think it's actually not a research question for those of us who study jihadi groups, because this is not about the groups, this is about the society in general. So I think this is a topic more generally for Middle Eastern scholars, those who specialize in surveying, explaining, investigating popular attitudes, how they are created, how they change, and change over time, and so on. Okay. I have a sense when I think about Middle East studies that there are certain facts and narratives in Middle East studies that we don't always question or revisit, at least not with the depth and seriousness that they require. We have, of course, all of us have heard the phrase, the invasion of Iraq was the most catastrophic event in modern Middle Eastern history, full stop. And there are very many good reasons for saying that the Iraq war was a catastrophe in many ways. But what I have not come across is any in-depth academic attempt at a counterfactual history of what would have happened if Saddam Hussein had remained in power. Regarding the region, Iraq and the region. I do not claim that such studies do not exist at all. I have searched and I have found studies, some such studies, but I've so far failed to find, most of them are related to aspects of the Iraq war from an American side. Looking at the American part of the equation. But here are two other examples. One has to do with interrogation tactics, and the conclusion of that counterfactual is that when this is an experiment and respondents or those who participate tend to be more positive or more accepting of U.S. abuses if they're sort of if they talk about what would have happened if Saddam remained in power and he would have treated the prisoners even worse. So after those respondents who took part in that experience, they would be more positive to or accepting of U.S. abuses. So it's quite unrelated to what I'm talking about. There is another one talking about German participation in intervention in Iraq and Libya, also a counterfactual study. So there are counterfactual studies and there is a way of going about doing them. And given the importance of the Iraq war, it is a bit surprising to me that the topic has not been studied in more depth and by more people. simply by looking at the implications of various alternatives of an invitation would perhaps inform the debate. Obviously, there is a great discussion: is counterfactual history, is that academic history, is that scientific? And critics, some would say, it involves so much guesswork that is not really worth the effort. But I've also read quite convincing arguments for the contrary. Okay, I'm going to move to more unfamiliar territory. Some of the narratives in Middle East studies have sort of become a fact. At least, if you're looking at themes that you don't study yourself, you sort of get, this is sort of the accepted version of things. And one of these facts I'm going to talk about now is the CIA coup in Iran in 1953, toppling the democratically elected government of Mossadegh. Obviously, I'm not an Iran expert, so I'm clearly on very shaky ground here, but why not step outside the comfort zone for a minute? So I just would like to share one reflection I have as a layperson regarding the CIA coup, because I've sort of long accepted, obviously, the narrative that the CIA staged a coup, a successful coup, and it has gone down in history as one of the United States' historical sins in the region, so much that the Obama administration admitted to the role in the coup against Mossadegh, and that was part of the negotiation with the nuclear deal and so on, or before that. And in recent years, a lot of documents have been released about the coup, US documents. But what I struggle with a bit is the very labeling of the event as a CIA coup. Does it mean that the CIA was the one who did it? So the CIA was the only actor involved? Was it sort of the key driving force behind the coup? Or is this sort of a typical case where we overstate the influence of external powers and underestimate the agency of local actors? I mean, how is it that a coup could succeed? Because obviously it failed on the first attempt. And in my head, if a coup fails, the plotters flee abroad, they run for their lives, and the case is closed. You don't really get a second chance 2 weeks later. Perhaps in a few years you can reconstitute a group and you can stage a coup. So more generally, it sort of poses the question: where do we draw a line between a military coup orchestrated by the CIA and local backers, or a power struggle between several competing factions inside the country, and the CIA supports one of them? So the sources released about the coup leave obviously little doubt that the CIA had a lot of activities in Iran at the time, but it's not so obvious to me that all of these activities had the intended effect. And even more, it's very obvious from the sources that the CIA was not on the top of the situation all the time. And here are some interesting quotes from one of the sources. It's a famous article by James Risen back in 2000 in the New York Times, based on what was written as an internal CIA history of the coup. It was meant for internal consumption, and it was then released many years later. So this, you can read this, TPAX is the name of the operation. So the message sent to Iran that night said the operation had tried and failed. And in the absence of strong recommendation to the contrary, they should discontinue the operation. So, but just as the Americans were ready to quit, the mood on the street of Tehran shifted, and let's go to the next one. So the CIA tried to exploit the situation, sending urgent messages and so on. But the final sentence there, but things were moving far too quickly for the agency to manage. It doesn't seem like it strikes me that this is not an agency in total control. And then the final excerpt here. The Soviet Union was caught completely off guard, even as the Mossad government was failing. Moscow radio broadcasting, But the CIA headquarters was as surprised as Moscow. So when the news of the coup's survival success arrived, it seemed like a bad joke. I mean, it's obviously, they were surprised that it actually succeeded. I mean, so it gives me sort of an indication that, this isn't something that the CIA sort of owned and controlled from the very beginning. I know there are neoconservative pundits in the US who have argued that the CIA's role in the coup has been overblown, and the CIA's impact on events in 1953 was insignificant, I quote, because Mossadegh was bound to fall. Obviously, we would love to trash the neoconservatives. And I think all of us, we tend to sort of, or many of us tend to despise them so much that we never take their arguments seriously. But still, we cannot dismiss interpretation just because they somehow coincide with right-wing narratives. Obviously, we have to look at all documents with an open mind and stay clear of any thinking about whose cause are these documents or these interpretations serving. How might this interpretation or that be misused by ideological hardliner or right-wing pundits? So this brings me to one of my final topics, namely the issue of taboo sources. We've talked about taboo topics, but now sources. So obviously some sources are ideologically marred or so toxic, and they shouldn't be used just because of that. And I remember when I did my work on the Palestinian police, I distinctly recall how I was berated and criticized for having cited a right-wing Israeli source in a particular section. And in that section I discussed what was then, this was written in the late 1990s, before the Al-Aqsa Intifada in September 2000. And I found, I was interpreting and discussing what was then clear indications that the Palestinian Authority was hoarding arms, was preparing for a possible military showdown with Israel. And this was obviously a topic right in the heart of the Israeli right-wing media. So they paid lots of attention to it. But more mainstream media was sort of, no, they're exaggerating. It's detrimental to the peace effort, so we shouldn't write so much about it. So I don't know. But obviously the right-wing media had this all over. But what happened, and I discovered that later, actually quite shortly after the outbreak of the Al-Aqsa Intifada in September 2000, that it was more than obvious that the PA had acquired quite an impressive array of military hardware and weapons. Quite into the Al-Aqsa Intifada, the Palestinian Authority on some of these militants were blowing up Israeli tanks using C4 explosives, quite sophisticated operations. So that particular thing showed me that even the right-wing Israeli press had underestimated the scale of the Palestinian Authority's weapons smuggling and weapons production. So it wasn't as bad as the right-wing Israeli press said. It was worse, I mean, from an Israeli perspective. But this was not a point to my critics. My sin was that I had sort of cited a right-wing and toxic source. So why is it that the ideological orientation of our sources is important, or should it be important? Should some sources, even if they're available, be shunned just because they're sort of ideologically or ethically toxic or unacceptable? So is it, for example, unethical to use WikiLeaks and its 2 million or so Cablegate files? These were files that were leaked to WikiLeaks and it showed correspondence, U.S. State Department correspondence over a number of years until 2010. And these sources were obviously stolen. I mean, these were leaked, classified sources mostly. But in the Middle East community, studies community, I've never come across anyone who has somehow said that it's unethical to use Cablegate. I do not think in myself that it is. I mean, I do see there might be legal issues regarding privacy. Perhaps there is some personal information that should be protected and so on. But I think it's a very good source, and I encourage my students to use it. And I think it's actually underused. Martin Frampton, who wrote a wonderful book on the Muslim Brotherhood and its relationship to the United States, he has used the WikiLeaks document in this very good article here. But the issue of stolen documents is interesting, because while very few would in the Middle East studies community would be concerned about the ethics of stealing documents from the U.S. Department of State, obviously the MESA president of the Middle East Studies Association in the U.S., she was very outraged by another document heist, namely that of the New York Times journalist Rukmini Callimachi and her team. They collected some 15,000 ISIS documents in Iraq, outside Mosul, I think it was, mostly, in the wake of the liberation of the ISIS-controlled territories there. So obviously the two cases are not similar, and this is not the place for discussing the legal issues here and so on. But my point is more that the very strong MESA action there on the ISIS files, because the ISIS, the New York Times and these documents were given to George Washington University, and they were digitizing it, and they were going to use it and store it there, and that was what triggered, I think, the MESA president's action. But there was also a special panel on this at the MESA conference in Boston last year. So who would want to base his PhD on sources from these documents if you want to have sort of a career in Middle East studies, when the sources has been so vilified and there's so much controversy around it, and the MESA president take that kind of very harsh stand on these documents. Let me move on to a final theme. I mean, there's a lot of pressure on us to be relevant to society. I mean, this is one of the burdens that we feel very much over the past few years, that we have to report more and more impact. And traditionally, I think perhaps this is just my impression, but there is a predilection in the Middle East studies community for obscure and exotic themes, and perhaps it's because then we can keep this topic to ourselves. Then perhaps that allows us for long and uninterrupted inquiry. You know, no one's going to compete with us on this very small and exotic theme. We also spend quite a lot of time complaining about the requirements for outreach and for demonstrating relevance to society and so on. But I think it's a valid criticism that we could perhaps try to be a bit more relevant. I mean, at this conference, I was part of a panel on climate change and the green shift in the Middle East, but very few actually in the Middle East studies community pay attention to climate change. And since given the importance of the topic, I mean, perhaps more of us should do so. I mean, there are studies on climate change in the Middle East, but many of these efforts are being done or undertaken outside of traditional Middle East studies. And also another theme, how come that so few of us study and specialize in economics and study Middle Eastern economies? Most people in the Middle East complain about a bad economy. You know, why? And how is it that so few of us care about studying the region's economy when this is such an important thing for those who live there? So apparently, and this is a bit of a joke, I mean, instead of studying distant economy, some in the Middle East studies community prefer to study, have a more sort of intimate focus instead. But I think it's fair to say that many highly policy relevant topics are studied and researched mostly outside of university academia and in the think tank community and research centers will have a much greater policy focus than we at the universities have because they depend on external funding. So I guess at the university we have evaded the burden of being policy relevant, but this is obviously about to change. There will be a panel I know after later today on Middle East studies in the Nordic countries. So I think that's going to be a very interesting round table panel, and I encourage all of you to go there. So my time is up, and I thank you very much for your attention.